McDermott,
Representing
Santa Barbara Youth Council.
and Felicia.
And I'm Alicia Flores, representing the youth.
And we're ready for the staff report if you'd like. Oh,
Okay. Okay. My name is Roberta Payan. I'm the program coordinator of the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Prevention Teen Coalition. I will be assisting Evelyn Aldapa doing the presentation today. Okay. We'd like to thank you for allowing us to work with you in this process. We're honored to be before you today to discuss the proposed social host ordinance. As you're aware, the ADAP Teen Coalition has been funded by the County of Santa Barbara Alcohol and Drug Programs Prevention Component for the past 6 years, and we'd like to recognize them for making this project possible. ADAP has worked tirelessly using environmental prevention strategies with our many prevention partners, including Fighting Back, Friday Night Live, Future Leaders of America, the Santa Barbara Police Department, in order to reduce underage access to alcohol and drugs and creating healthy communities. One of the main goals of environmental prevention is to positively impact public policy. We believe the proposed social host ordinance to be one of those policies and are proud of the part that we have played in this community-wide youth-led effort.
As you are aware already, the proposed social host ordinance is a law that would hold non-commercial individuals responsible for providing a venue for underage drinking. While we realize that there are many contributing factors to the problem of underage access, use, and abuse of alcohol among teens, the data we have collected indicates that there is a need for accountability and education when it comes to understanding the problem. Instead of looking at the youth in our community as part of the problem, our youth advocates have decided to be part of the solution. A show can be an effective deterrent to underage drinking. In February 2007, Lisa Gilbert, Prevention Coordinator for the Santa Barbara County, conducted a focus group with the ADAP members. It was a very lively group discussion, to say the least. We had a lot of questions and figured that other teens would too. So we decided to facilitate peer focus groups in the schools. Although it was a small sample, further research indicated that it was a representative of trends nationwide. An alarming increase in underage drinking consumption and related tragedies were attributed to social hosting. As you can see, the data clearly suggests a problem. As one youth put it, it's easier to get alcohol than to check out a library book in Santa Barbara.
can I ask one question on that? The 64% adults allow underage drinking in their home. Is the statistic that 64% of students know an adult that allows underage drinking in their home, or that 64% of their parents allow drinking in their home?
64 of the youth surveyed indicated that they knew adults who allowed underage drinking in their home on a regular basis.
Okay. And one other note for anyone who wants to do public comment on this, there's form, just a little brief form to fill out, and then you pass it to her. Okay.
The history of the social host ordinance in California began with the city of San Diego in 2003. The city of Santa Maria was the first city in the county of Santa Barbara to establish what we call a mini ordinance in late 2003. Over in Ventura County, our neighbors to the south, the city of Ojai was first. And of course, Dave Moore was very instrumental in getting the city of Carpinteria to adopt the social host ordinance in March of 2007 with great effectiveness out there. Currently, the county of Ventura is the only county in the United States to have all of their jurisdictions currently covered by an ordinance. And there are now 44 social host ordinances in the United States.
The history of the show on ADAP goes back a year and a half. We partnered with Fighting Back, Public Policy Task Force, Future Leaders of America, and Friday Night Live to bring the topic into the community forum by hosting speakouts with expert panelists and community input. In November, we partnered with the Youth Council on a workshop with key community leaders, including Police Department and CADA. The Youth Council unanimously endorsed the ordinance and made a commitment to work with ADAP to conduct further research and form recommendations to be considered when the ordinance went to council. On April 8th, the City Council also unanimously endorsed the ordinance and requested that ADAP and the Youth Council continue to work with the City Attorney to draft the ordinance for review. Currently, the County of Santa Barbara is drafting a countywide ordinance to ensure no gaps in service. The Youth Council and ADAP came up with these recommendations. An educational component. We have always viewed the ordinance as a necessary and useful learning tool for the community at large, as well as those involved in social hosting. The ordinance will provide an opportunity to educate, not punish. For these reasons, we recommend that, similar to the City of Comprometeria, there be an educational component allowing people to take a class in lieu of paying the fine on the first offense. A community awareness campaign. ADAP has already been involved in creating community awareness campaigns, as have other prevention agencies through PSAs and brochures designed to explain the ordinance in both English and Spanish. Portions of funds go to youth prevention programs and continue youth involvement. We are very pleased that the Youth Council felt it was imperative to keep youth involved in the process. We are very committed to this effort for the duration. We would like to thank you for this opportunity and be part of creating Santa Barbara public policy.
Having met on several occasions with key city representatives and community leaders, ADAP and Youth Council representatives modified some of our recommendations, and I think I got things out of order here, and I do apologize. So, I'm sorry, going back to this, we originally had asked for an educational component, and we are pleased that we're in the process of establishing an agreement with CADA and Teen Court to provide that educational component similar to what the City of Carpinteria has. We initially had asked for a fine in the amount of $500 originally, and that was because we were taking into consideration some of the low-income families. But in those meetings with city officials and police, especially Officer Whittam right here, we thought we would bring the fine from $500 up to $1,000, and that way people would want to take the educational component and instead of just paying the fine. We also asked that the community awareness campaign go hand in hand with the ordinance once it's passed. And as Evie mentioned, ADAP is in the process of creating PSAs to be posted on radio, local TV. We're having our current social host ordinance brochures translated into Spanish. We have purchased ad space in several publications, anticipating when it gets passed to get the information out to the community. In addition to that, in an effort to eliminate the gaps in service, ADAP and the Youth Council will be working closely with CADA and the Fighting Back Public Policy Task Force to create a countywide ordinance. And as we mentioned, we're very pleased that we will continue to have community youth involvement in this entire process. Currently, the next steps are, we're hoping, will be the adoption of the ordinance, an ongoing community awareness campaign, a continuing educational component, and then also something in place to evaluate the effectiveness of the ordinance should it be passed. And that completes our presentation.
We'll take questions from both ordinance committee members and our youth representatives. Mr. Francisco?
Thank you, Chairman Williams. I have some questions about the statistics, if we could go back to those. Mm-hmm. First, explain again how these statistics were gathered.
I don't know how to go back. Okay. Back in February 2007, when we did the initial, I'm having a problem here. When we did the initial focus group with our group, the youth thought that there was a lot of questions that maybe a lot of other youth had concerns or issues regarding this proposed ordinance. So the youth took peer focus group training. They actually learned how to facilitate focus groups. We contacted several schools, community groups, and went out into those schools and presented the ordinance, the draft ordinance, and we explained to them the different elements of the ordinance, with or without knowledge, what constitutes a party, civil versus criminal punishment, educational component, all the different elements of it, and we really prefaced all that with the question: do you think that there's a problem of underage drinking in the city of Santa Barbara? Overwhelmingly, they said yes. And when we went on and established a list of 20 questions, the same 20 questions we used with each group, the youth, over 90%, said that home was the #1 place. Even if it wasn't their home, somebody's home was the #1 place for them to get and consume alcohol. A lot of the youth, as Evie mentioned, said it was so easy to get alcohol, it was easier than checking out a library book. In light of what's happening in the city lately with a lot of youth violence over the last year and the concerns with that, we did include a question asking the youth their perception of whether or not they thought underage drinking was connected to youth violence, and as you can see, 80% of them felt it was. Although it was a very small sampling, actually after this slide, we probably went up to about 200 youth that we surveyed. It really did fit into the national trends.
And how were those 200 people selected?
Primarily, we went to the mainstream campuses. We went to some leadership groups. We also went to community groups like Future Leaders of America. Friday Night Live surveyed some of their youth. We also went to some of the non-traditional campuses, alternative schools, continuation schools, community day school.
But within each of those places that you went, how did you actually select the people who participated in the survey?
A lot of the groups contacted us, actually. Once we started the initial contact, we started with Bishop High School, we started with San Marcos High School, Friday Night Live groups. Some of the publicity we were getting in the newspaper, groups started contacting us, like the Junior Statesmen of America out of Santa Barbara High School, which had us go out and do a presentation there. So a lot of the groups wanted to find out more about the ordinance and give their input.
So it sounds as though a lot of the participants in the survey were self-selected.
Yes.
And though that does not in itself invalidate the survey, I just want to make it clear that this was not a poll in the sense of going out to the general population and finding out what the trends were. This is actually the trends within a self-selected group.
Right.
Thank you.
Mr. McDermott?
I see that in the civil penalty part of the actual ordinance, it says that there's like $1,000, and I was wondering where the $1,000 goes, where that $1,000 goes, whether it's in the general funds or if it actually does go to prevention, education, like the original process.
I think Nancy could probably answer that.
Thought I'd step forward to address that one. That actually is something that we are exploring further with staff. The possibility currently, this fine would join other fines and penalties in that it currently does just go into a fund and sources are not tracked by the city. But we had discussion. We had a discussion involving city administration, city attorney's office. It's more of, is there a system in place that could track the funds? And we're looking at this not just for this particular fine, but also related to some other fines that we're talking about expanding, and such as with the forestry and our street tree ordinances and things like that. So it is not an easily accommodated objective. So it's something that we would be interested in looking at and will in fact be looking at it on a broader basis within the city. But currently we're not able to track it that way.
In the past, what we've done is we've tried to project how much money might be raised by it and then bolster that budget of that program in expectation and then track how many tickets we're actually allocating. It's a pretty imperfect system at this time. Mr. House?
Well, just to follow up on that, is there any restriction, Mr. Vincent, against us keeping track of the of funds that are generated by these penalties?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, there's no legal restriction that would force the city into one process or another. I think, as Ms. Rapp outlined, many of the issues are administrative, and how to set up the financial accounting in the first place. And then, as I was listening to Ms. Rapp's answer, it also came to mind that if council chose to dedicate a percentage or a portion of any fines received, there probably would be an entirely new process for how to spend that money. In other words, I could see where it would be similar to your community development block grant allocation process, where you'd be looking for proposals from youth groups or something like that to come to you explaining how they would anticipate spending those funds. Again, the answer really ultimately is that it's still a work in progress as to how to set up any such program, and that there is no particular limitation on council's discretion.
Understood. That's great to know. And then, as I read the ordinance itself, which we haven't discussed really yet, I was surprised at how very simple it is. We get some pretty complex things here, and this one just cuts to the chase with some really clear definitions, and then it has a civil penalty. And just the basic unlawful gatherings are described. Host presumption, that is who it is that would be affected, be penalized if they were to have hosted a gathering of some sort that where minors would have exposure to and be imbibing, and alcohol and public nuisance, and what that's about, civil penalty, and then the remedies. And one of the things that seemed important to all of us has been that we have some way of looking back after a year or so and seeing whether we think we're being effective or if it's working. I don't see that referenced here. It's more seems like part of what a staff report might include that would go along with the ordinance itself. But is there a particular place where would we actually identify that we would want to have some place for some feedback? Would that be in the ordinance itself, or would it be some other way?
Mr. Chair, to respond to that question, generally we don't include that kind of language in the ordinance itself. It is more a directive from the council to staff.
Part of the resolution from City Council?
There can be a resolution or even just a council minute order, the council agenda item that reflects a recommendation that's approved by the City Council. And I'm sure Ms. Rapp would probably have an answer to that as well.
Thank you, Chair Williams and Councilmember House. I would concur that I think the appropriate place is for the staff report, and referring back to the previous conversation about could a portion of the fines be redirected to support the youth efforts against alcohol use. And I think that both of those could be addressed in the staff report. I think council could give a period of time, whether it's a review at the conclusion of 1 year after the program has been implemented, to come back to council with a report on how it went and to the best we're able to determine a level of effectiveness. And then also, if council would like staff to continue to pursue administrative processes to see if we can actually identify the funds that come out of this from fines that could be redirected. Currently, we're not able to do that, but that would be something that we would continue to work at. I don't think there was any resistance to the idea. People were very supportive of the idea. It was just more a matter of how do we make this happen? We're already having that issue in some other instances.
Would a likely report back after a year or two or some period of time say that there were so many violations and there were and so many opted for the educational component and so many were second offenders? There was some sort of recidivism. I mean, do we have any way to accomplish that data, or?
Yes, and I would defer to Lieutenant Whittam on that. Do you want
I just want to thank, Chair Williams, I just want to thank those who came today to help us with this, by the way. It's nice having people, just like to be able to do that little ball pass here. You know, that is really great, so that we can get these questions answered, and you're prepared for that. Thank you very much.
Councilmember House, other committee members. Yes, what we'll do, the way that this ordinance will be enforced is currently we don't have the ability on, when we walk into a private residence, to issue citations per state law to underage drinkers. Minor possession only occurs when it's in public. So what this would do is give us that civil remedy, which the process would be is the police department would enter a party scene where there are many drinkers there, determine whether there are underage drinkers there, and then write a report. There would be no citations issued on the spot. We had discussed this previously with the city attorney's office as to the methodology to make this a smooth transition because it's a civil penalty, not a criminal one. So the police department officers would write out a police report and forward that to the city attorney's office for a recommendation of a filing of this law, the new ordinance, for them to process it as a civil remedy. Through that mechanism, the police department and the city attorney's office will have an actual tracking mechanism for how many have occurred on a yearly basis. This police department is currently transitioning from a very old system of what's called RMS, or records management system, into a brand new one, of which you're probably aware, which has a very good tracking mechanism for all of our activities. So that component, I think, would be a very simple one to track on a daily, weekly, day of the week, month, yearly basis. And the dispositions, I'm sure we can set up a disposition from the city attorney's office back to the police department, which we could gather those statistics for you as to who's choosing to take the educational component, who's choosing to pay the fine, and how many of these have occurred.
That's just wonderful. Okay, well, I'm glad that dovetails with that. So it's civil penalty. This isn't one of those 3 strikes kinds of offenses.
Correct.
So it's at the civil level. That's great, and the educational emphasis. And have you gotten any feedback from others in the department on how you think this might play out, and whether you see this as possibly an effective tool, or are you prepared to give us some
Yeah, absolutely.
idea?
We have at our monthly managers meeting, and then we disseminate that information throughout our patrol briefing watches. And since I had taken the head of this, I've made sure the information has gone down to the officers who think that if you want it in the lowest common denominator, they think it's about time. Because time and time again, we've gone to these parties to where there are underage drinkers, and we cannot take any action other than breaking up the party. And typically, let me run you through how a typical police officer would respond to one of these parties. Is if we're driving by a loud party, police officers just peace cannot be disturbed. So in other words, we can't generate the complaint itself of a loud noise, loud complaint. They'll typically come in through another citizen who's complaining about a disturbance, typically the loud noise, the loud party, and we don't. There are a lot of those. We get those, especially on the Friday or Saturday nights. Different areas of the city, generate more of those type of complaints. When we show up, I would say more often than not, we don't have a complainant willing to sign a complaint. Remember, this is still a misdemeanor. It's not happening in our presence. You can't disturb our peace. So to take enforcement action, we would actually have to have a citizen sign a complaint for that misdemeanor. Typically, that doesn't happen. They just don't want to get involved. They just want us to go and break up the party, which most of the time is effective. We'll walk in, we'll say, hey, party's over. You have somebody that's complaining, second complaint. There's a possibility of you getting issued a misdemeanor ticket. So we walk in, we find underage drinkers there. Unless we somehow walk out onto the sidewalk or into a public place, we can't take action. We can in certain cases when the parents are there, and we could cite them for contributing to the delinquency of a minor, things like that, but typically that's not the case. So now when we show up, and a lot of times, parents are out of town, there may be a responsible adult there, but and it does happen where we'll cite these people for contributing to the delinquency of a minor, but it's kind of a rare case when that happens. Now, fast forward into having this ordinance, same situation, we walk into a party, there are minors drinking, there is a person who's responsible for that party. We're now going to create a report saying that person who's responsible either for the residents or the party is going to have a civil assessment against them, and it's going to be in the amount of what's under discussion is $1,000. I thought the $500 was a little too low if we were going to have an educational component vis-a-vis a way out of paying that fine. What we want to do is make sure that persons of all financial backgrounds have an incentive to take this educational component. You know, if it's $500, I'll just pay that. You know, we don't want that. We want that fine to be such that they want to take that educational component for the first time. So now it gives us that tool in our toolbox as law enforcement where we're going to see, I think, a lessening of the alcohol, the youth alcohol drinking in locations around, say, City College. That's one of our prime areas on the east side, west side. It does happen everywhere, but, you know, you have the college community around City College, and it's a big problem in those areas. So back to the original question, how do the officers and the rank and file of the police department feel? They feel that this will be a valuable tool for us to take care of a problem that's been going on for a long time, that now we'll have actually something that we can do about it. And the fact that it's a civil assessment and not a criminal one, and giving them those educational component, I think everybody at the police department is really for that.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much. That's all my questions, but I will have comments when it comes time.
Do we have any public comment? None? Any items of the ordinance that you want to highlight, Mr. Vincent?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, I after hearing Officer Whittam's explanation of how the party would go, I'd like to walk the Ordinance Committee through how the resolution of the fine would work. As you mentioned, the police officer would write a report and deliver that report to the city attorney's office. We would then initiate the administrative citation process. It would be a matter of sending out basically a letter to the person responsible for the party. Under the ordinance, there are 3 different types of people who will be responsible for, or potentially responsible for the party. First is the person who owns the property. Second, a person who rents the property. Or third, the person in control of the property at that time during the event. What this does is it gives the city attorney's office the opportunity to take the evidence that the officers have given us in that report and select the appropriate person to be responsible for that event. In the case of an owner-occupied residence, a presumption would be that the owner of that property is responsible for what occurs on that property. In the case of rented property, whether it's an apartment unit or a single-family home, the presumption would shift to the person who rents the property. Then, on a case-by-case basis, depending on the circumstances, a person may be in control of the event may be different than the owner or the renter of that property. An example I would give, and this is one point I wanted to clarify from the staff report, is that this is going to apply to any private property. There isn't a distinction of commercial or non-commercial, commercial or residential. So a case where it might be most appropriate, where a person in control of the property as opposed to an owner or a tenant, would be let's assume that there's an empty warehouse that somebody finds out about it. They decide to have a rave. The owner of the property isn't really going to be the correct person. This is a person who's trespassing. They've decided, they found an empty piece of commercial property. They've decided to have a rave. They have no permission from any of the lawful owners or tenants of that property. That would be the circumstance where the person who's in control of the event is the appropriate person to be assessed this fine, not the owner or the tenant of that property. So the definition of person does give the city attorney's office some flexibility based on the evidence that the police officers give us as to who is the appropriate person to receive this citation. Once the citation is issued, it will be issued by basically writing a letter to the person who we determine is the appropriate person. They would then be given the opportunity, that letter would present the option of the educational component or simply paying the fine. If they choose to challenge the fine, they can request an administrative hearing. That has one level of appeal process. Once that that second appeal, or that they would have a hearing, they would have an appeal hearing. After that appeal hearing, the city's involvement would be finished. There would be one final appeal level at Superior Court based on the administrative record that had already been prepared through the city's process. This is all laid out. One of the reasons why this ordinance can be somewhat simple is the fact that we rely significantly on Chapter 1.25 of the city's municipal code to lay out the procedural processes, and that's all in the administrative citation process.
And Mr. Vincent, there's, I think, isn't there a fourth, if the person responsible for the event is a juvenile, it says juvenile, it says then the parents or guardians of that juvenile, and the juvenile shall be considered the persons and shall be jointly and severably liable for the civil penalties, et cetera. So there is a situation where some young people put up a party all by themselves and don't involve an adult, and in which case then it defaults to the parents of the young person.
That's correct.
Mr. Francisco, you've been waiting for a question for a while, or is it a comment?
It's become a comment.
Okay.
It started as a question. Lieutenant, I think you answered what I was going to ask, but I want to make it clear, because I had several questions from constituents about this, that there are social host ordinances out there in other states where there are third-party liability implications and criminal penalties. So, for instance, you're serving alcohol at a party, someone leaves the party, they get into an accident, and you can be held liable in that accident. This is nothing like that. This is actually a very, I would say, a very modest, conservative step. And what it's really doing is giving the police more tools to deal with neighborhood nuisances, if you will.
Councilmember Francisco and council members, yes, that is exactly what this is. It doesn't take away any of the other laws that we have. It just adds a civil assessment, another tool for us to use in those cases. Every time we go to an incident, every single one is different, with different dynamics. And there are different of the appropriateness of the actions that we take. And one of the things that when we met with the youth council was some misconceptions about what the police do, and oftentimes they thought that, gosh, the police are going to come and they're going to haul away parents into jail, and that's just simply not what's going to happen from this ordinance. This is simply civil, and that we all have to remember as well, officers have discretion at the scene to take appropriate action. There are certain laws that mandate we take certain actions, like in domestic violence, and this is not that. The officers still have discretion to write the report and send a report to the city attorney's office to who we deem would be the most responsible person for that party. And I believe this ordinance gives us that discretion as well.
Thank you.
Mr. McDermott?
I have a question. In the ordinance, it appears that there's no second offense. What is the process for a second offense? And I also have a recommendation that Santa Barbara Youth Council and ADOP have thought of for that. So, or do you want me to say it? Okay. Well, something that we were discussing is because it would be a second offense, we believe it should be escalated. And I believe in the proposed ordinance, it says, staff discussed whether an escalating penalty above $1,000 could be set for repeat offenders. And we were thinking maybe $1,500, maybe even upward, near $2,000. However, you could still have an education in lieu of the fine, but with the educational component, have a fine so that instead of just getting out of this $1,000 every time, it's tagged with a reduction in the fine, so it's still an escalating penalty and more of a deterrent for future offenders.
Chair Williams, council members, and Mr. McDermott, thank you. That is why I stepped up to the plate, because that was much of the discussion that took place. When all of the youth involved came forward, they did have an escalating penalty as part of their fee structure. When the recommendation from staff was to, if your ultimate goal is to have people go through the education component, we really felt stay with the higher fee. It will really be the motivator to have people go through the education component. And we, in the meeting that we had with the city attorney, there was some concern on the city attorney part, and that's why I was just double checking with Mr. Vincent as to whether, in fact, there were limitations of going beyond $1,000. So I'm going to ask him to address that. Essentially, when we looked at some other ordinances in other communities, their fees escalated up. I think I remember seeing one that was $2,500 and then even $5,000. So I am going to defer to the city attorney to provide you guidance on that. We were, as staff, when we looked at what came forward in the goals, we did feel that having some kind of escalating penalty situation, I'm sure the situations would be very, very few where you have the repeat offenders. So we would support if you wanted to explore some type of escalating penalty. But I would defer to Mr. Vincent.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The concern comes from the fact that the state statute that authorizes administrative citation ordinances, the process of processing civil penalties as opposed to going through a criminal process, has a limit on the fines that can be assessed if the violation is otherwise an infraction, which is essentially the lowest level of a criminal offense. That limit, so that's part of it. However, the municipal code says that all violations of the municipal code are misdemeanors unless otherwise specified. This ordinance won't specify it, and so it will be treated in essentially a no man's land. The statute that authorizes the administrative citation process puts a limit on the penalties for infractions, but puts no limit and authorizes no number. It just doesn't specify any kind of guide, or doesn't provide any guidance as to an appropriate civil penalty for violations that are not infractions. In that absence of guidance, my suggestion initially was to put the upper limit at the same limit that the city can have for violations of the municipal code, $1,000 and or 6 months in jail. Those are the penalties. Also happen to be the same for any other misdemeanor. This ordinance will not have a criminal penalty. It will not have any jail time. I was just using the number as that's the maximum number that the city can otherwise charge somebody for a financial penalty. I suspect that those other jurisdictions that have gone above and beyond $1,000 are essentially looking to their own general police powers and saying, in the absence of a conflicting state statute, we can do what we want. So I think that's the explanation as to where these other jurisdictions are going. There is no explicit authority that says, yes, you can have a civil penalty of $5,000. Then again, there is no explicit prohibition. And so some jurisdictions have decided to go into that realm. We started with a recommendation of $1,000, but I believe the City Council could consider a different number as well. The last point I would like to make is that while there is only one fine amount, there is a small element of escalation in our ordinance, in the sense that the educational component is only allowed or only available for the first offense. The second or any subsequent offense is the $1,000. There is no opportunity for that educational component. What Mr. McDermott suggested is much more along the lines of what the City of Carpinteria has done, which is educational component the first time. Second time around, fine, but that fine can be reduced if you go to the educational component a second time. And then the third and subsequent offenses, I believe, are actually just fines and no opportunity for an educational component. So that's another way to go. We started with the simplistic ordinance. It's not a huge complication to add in that second element, but our initial recommendation was fairly simple.
But you have no overriding feeling that it would be vulnerable to challenge if we changed it?
Mr. Chair, I no more so than any other ordinance. in the sense that I would feel much more confident if there was a state statute that I could point to and says you can have a civil penalty of higher than $1,000. I'm very confident with the 1,000 number. I'd only be slightly less confident with a higher number, but absent a conflicting state statute, we as a charter city do have in our general police powers the ability to adopt laws that are not in conflict with state law. And with the absence of a state law with which we would conflict, I think we can do it.
And what were the Carpinteria penalties again? If you remember, Mr. Vincent. If you don't, I don't expect you to
Chair,
be an encyclopedia.
I don't remember them off the top of my head. I do remember the structure, though, and maybe the sheriff deputy might have them.
Thank you, Mr. Olmsted. A question or comment from Ms. Flores.
Thank you. It sounds like the educational component is the #1 recommendation. Where are you with that?
It's my understanding that I guess talks are taking place currently with CADA and Teen Court and their parent program in order to establish an agreement or an MOU to provide the classes for the people that are cited on the first offense. But I think kind of to clarify what Chris was talking about, I think we were talking about having the educational component be part of every time, but Chris, wasn't that?
Mr. McDermott, why don't you explain
Yeah.
that?
Well, when we were discussing that, a question came up, and I don't know who can answer this, but I think someone said you cannot force an offender to go to class. So if anyone has an answer to that, that would be nice.
Well, we could assess the value of the taking a class to be equivalent to $1,000, and then have the first offense be $1,000, which if they took the class would be $0. The second offense be $2,000, which if they took the class would be $1,000, and progressively upward. And if that's the recommendation that people want to make, we could do that. We could do that today.
So you can actually make an offender go to the class? Oh, you can. Okay.
I didn't answer that question that way. No, the way typically it would be done would be to create the incentive to go to the class every single time. But maybe Mr. Vincent can elaborate on that.
Mr. Chair, I think that's exactly what the City of Carpinteria did in the structure of their ordinance, was to avoid this question entirely. It was to create the incentive, to give the individual who's been charged with the violation the option. They could either pay the full freight, or they could have that educational component and pay something less. And as you say, that creates the incentive. So the only other thing I would comment on is that we do use our administrative citation process to achieve particular performances. We use the administrative citation process to enforce our zoning ordinances, where in addition to the fine, they've got to come back into compliance with the zoning ordinance by doing whatever the zoning ordinance requires. So I don't have a complete concern about it, but I think that the Carpinteria option is an elegant answer to the question, in that it creates the incentive, it avoids any particular forcing of a performance going to the class as opposed to just paying the fine. It's always the option. And so there's that incentive to take one or the other, but it's the election of the violator, not us telling them that they have to go to class.
Chair Williams and council and committee members, I do have the Carpinteria ordinance in front of me, so just to confirm, their first violation is $500, may be suspended upon proof of completion of the education component. Second violation is $1,000, and it can be reduced to $500 upon proof of completion within 60 days, and then subsequent fines beyond that are $1,000. So exactly structured the way that Mr. Vincent portrayed it.
Ms. Flores? Oh, you had your light on, but it's now off. Mr. House.
I like the idea of us having something that's consistent with our neighbor to the south, the 500 with education, the 1,000 with the 500 plus education, and then 1,000, which gives us scale, graduated scale of it. I think the a $500 fine is I know we've opted here and what's in front of us is 1,000 to start with, but I think the levels that they have in Carpinteria make sense to me. That's a significant hit, $500 for a situation like that, and they have an option out. Now, I guess I could imagine a very wealthy family for whom it wouldn't be a big deal to just write the $500 check, but let them try it again. I mean, now we're starting to move up the line. But I had a question that's just been bugging me, and I wanted to ask it. I remember as a teenager, my dad and I didn't get along real well there for a while. We've resolved all that, and he's a great guy. Turned out fine. But I'm imagining a situation where a young person who's really acting out inappropriately could host a party like we're talking about, get his parents into some real trouble, maybe even do it again or again, and some just really bad acting out could be happening, but who would be paying the penalty would be the parents, which might be just fine for the young person. How do you deal with a situation if that were to occur? And maybe I'm just making this up. We didn't have that bad of a thing at my house. I don't mean that. But I mean, how would we deal with that? How would the court or how would our city, how would we deal with a situation where it really was kind of a parents versus the young person, and the young people were really being inappropriate and acting out and hosting parties and bringing in alcohol, and it was just coming down on the parents, and they had lost that control? I mean, is that dealt? It must be dealt with elsewhere. It is up to the parent. Okay, well, after all.
Councilmember House and
yes.
Council members. Well, let's switch that over to parking violations, because you, as an owner of a car, lend your car to someone else. Guess who's responsible when you get a parking ticket?
Yeah.
That's why we have a hearing officer, can hear those cases. Now, you still may be financially responsible for that parking ticket. Mm-hmm. You at least get to tell your story to a hearing officer who may or may not dismiss that fine against you. Similarly, there's a component in here where we will have a hearing officer that will, in graduated steps of, like, I want a recourse to what happened to me. Mm-hmm. There'll be a hearing officer, and I don't think that's all been set up yet, okay. But it'll be something similar to what we have at the police department for those civil assessments in parking. Now, a hearing officer will have the authority to dismiss that case on a case-by-case basis. A situation like you have said, I've got a child who is 17 years old and he's hosting these parties and I was out of town. Well, there's also a component in there. You're still responsible for your 17-year-old child. Right. Should you be leaving him alone mm-hmm. and to host these parties, or should you have a little more control over that your child until they turn 18? So, it's one of those situations where, there is some responsibility upon the parent or that responsible person for that child. Why are they leaving them there alone to create these situations? So, but above and beyond that, there are going to be levels to contest the citation, the administrative citation against you. And, like I say, all I can say is we interject a lot of common sense when we do that. That's
part of the educational component is
yes.
You're actually talking to parents about their responsibilities and how that might be dealt with.
And perhaps that parent needs to go to take that deviation, of course, from the $500 or $1,000 fine and go to the educational component, bring their child with them mm-hmm. To resolve this, and then other resources can be applied to that conflict that the child and the parent are having. It's going to be one of those situations where there's a wide array of resources available in Santa Barbara to bring conflict to an end. Maybe counseling, this could be the step that's needed in that. So,
so that really goes to it. So if there were a situation like that, part of the educational component would be a point of contact with possible services, resources that might help a parent get control back, be able to deal with that kind of a situation. Counseling might be available. I mean, is this envisioned? I mean, first of all, it's not specifically in the social host ordinance, but would the process allow then there to be a point at which a parent who really was needing help? But I've met parents who say, I'm out of control of my young person. I don't know what to do.
And, that's still for discussion as to what the educational component is going to consist of, but it's meetings like this where the issues come out that maybe it should be. Additional resource availability will be made available at that time for, the family itself to prevent this from occurring in the future.
Okay, well, thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Oh, please.
If I can add to that answer. There, as Lieutenant Whittam explained, one, the opportunity for a hearing where the parents could explain themselves and explain the circumstances. I also wanted to point out the fact that the parental presumption where the parent and the child are jointly and severally liable, they both are. So the parents, the parents would be on the hook and the child would be on the hook.
Okay.
The hearing officer could dismiss the parents from the situation and leave the juvenile responsible and let the juvenile figure out how they're going to pay that fine or go to that class. The other point is that teaming up with teen court is that teen court has several different educational opportunities. They have ADAC, which is Alcohol and Drug Education class. They also have the Parent Project, which I think is one of the one of the programs that we were really planning on addressing this. I could see ADAC also applying. And so by partnering with Teen Court, an organization that has a number of educational opportunities that cover different types of issues, that you probably could tailor the experience. And the way the ordinance is written right now, it gives the city administrator the flexibility to recognize a whole list of a menu of programs, not just any particular one.
That's like on page 3 under civil penalty. And
exactly.
It says for the first-time offender, it says notice of the violation, a recognized counseling program such as teen court or alcohol rehabilitation education program as may be designated by the city administrator, et cetera. So that opens up the door to these kinds of resources.
Yes.
Mr. Chair and council members, just one other addition to that is you can see from the statistics here we do have an issue with this nationwide. That same scenario where the 17-year-old is having parties, the parent is out of town, with the way things are right now, that parent may not ever become aware that there is an issue, and through this mechanism they can be made aware that there's a problem that needs to be resolved.
Very good. And Ms. Rapp may have had a response to you.
Chair Williams and committee members, will you actually have somebody here from Fighting Back? If you would like them to speak a bit more on that aspect of the education.
Is that something
I would,
committee members
definitely,
would like?
absolutely.
And one request I have is to just, in the future, to change that slide because it reads as if 65% of adults allow underage drinking in their home when, according to the statistic, is 65% of students surveyed knew of an adult that allowed underage drinking in their home, and I think that's two very different things.
And Councilmember Francisco, just to, you had a question about the 91%, and I know that's not these were just self-selected students, but when we did a survey for the California Healthy Kids Survey, all the 7th graders, 9th graders, and 11th graders in our county were surveyed, and 86% actually said that they get alcohol from their home, and that's the #1 place where they get alcohol. So that is, 86% is significantly lower than 91%, but it's still a very large amount that are getting alcohol in their home.
86% of who?
Of the 7th, 9th, and 11th graders that were sampled, that were surveyed in our community from the California Healthy Kids Survey. But I am representing the council today, and I wanted to talk just a little bit about the educational components that are being considered for this social host ordinance. One is the parent program, which is a 6-week-long program, which parents are now actually self-selecting to come into, and it's run by Lino. Do you remember Lino's, what's Lino's last name? I'm horrible that I don't remember his last name. But it's actually run in Spanish and English, and it's exactly what you were talking about. Parents that are kind of saying, I'm out of control, I don't know what to do with my kid, help. And it's a parenting class on everything on how to communicate with your child, to what to do if your child is using, I believe even if you yourself are using. The teen court program is actually exactly what it sounds like. It's a jury of your peers, and you can, you're put on trial if you yourself were caught, using drugs, stealing, and then you also have the chance to be on the jury later on. So it's a great program that's also run through the council. And then we have another program called Super, which I'm not sure if that's up for discussion, but I actually think that it might be a very good program to be a part of this social host, because it's the parents and the child go through it together. And it's a 4-week-long program. And currently, that's what students who are caught in the schools using drugs or alcohol, and they're suspended for using drugs or alcohol, and it's on the second suspension, and they're at risk of being expelled from the school. So they have the choice of being expelled from the school district or going to Super with their parents for 4 weeks. And it's a drug and alcohol education class that they go through with their parents. And at the end, they have to write a letter to their parents for their parents to read. And it's a very, very I don't want to say life-changing, but it's a very effective class. And we also keep data on that if you were interested in seeing that. We have a few years' worth of data. So that would be a good one for students and their parents to go through together. Thank you.
Mr. McDermott?
All right, I have a few-part question about CARP. First, actually, we already heard what the fine is. I was wondering if if there have been any offenses in CARP, and if they've chosen to pay the fine or do the education course.
It's my understanding from Ed Quay that oversees teen court that the first year, I believe there was 2 citations issued. I'm sorry, my bad. The first year, over 40 citations. The second year, 2 citations issued. So they do view it as an effective deterrent down there.
And I was also wondering if whoever received the citation, if they chose to do the education component.
I don't think they've had any takers as of yet on the educational component, Valerie.
Well, that would indicate that we should have the higher fine.
Yeah.
That's what I was gonna say.
Kind of what we were thinking.
So does anybody have a suggestion for what kind of recommendation we want to give the city council on this? Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Chairman Williams. I'm fine with the recommendation as it is. I think this was, obviously it was discussed a lot, people thought about it, and I think we should recommend it as it is.
And Mr. House?
I think that was a very good question, Chris. Thank you. That helped me understand that we really want people in an educational environment for this, and also have point of contact for maybe very needed services, and this could push it over the edge and really get some parenting support or the young people themselves. But I have a concern, practically speaking, about this 60 days business, and that's on page 3 under civil penalty. It says the civil penalty for a first-time offender provided for in this chapter may be waived upon submission of proof of completion within 60 days of receipt of notice of the violation. It doesn't seem to be like a practical space if some of these programs may go on for a longer period of time than that. So I don't know what would be appropriate, whether this is okay, or if 120 days, 90 or 120 days. But I'm thinking of the time that I got a speeding ticket and I was given an amount of time to take that traffic school, which was very educational and has been very helpful to me staying within the speed limit. And but I had enough time to be able to complete it, and I appreciated that. Can somebody help us with that?
Mr. Chair, as I was hearing that the parent program takes 6 weeks, I was seeing where 60 days is starting to, that's cutting it pretty close. Super program at 4 weeks, and teen court, it would be, I would be surprised if a teenager was given more than 4 or 5 weeks worth of teen court jury service for an offense like this. We can extend that number. There's no magic to the 60-day number. However, as the further we extend that waiver, that period of time that we now have an unresolved violation, that someone's saying that they want to have the waiver, they want to avoid the $1,000 fine, and who wouldn't? But we have this unresolved case that's hanging out there and requiring that much more tracking. If we were to extend the number beyond 60 days, I would also recommend something where that they would have to come in, that there would be some kind of progress reports between that there would be evidence of entering the program, a progress report at some period of time, and then proof of completion by the time the waiver occurs.
Or could we leave it at 60 days and then have an arrangement by which if the program were to be longer than this, I mean, it's going to take them a couple weeks to get signed up for a program or be on the next queue, and then it takes however long to be part of it. But could there be just simply a way for them to get an approval for that to be longer because the program itself goes longer?
I mean, we can work on dealing with those practical realities. Yes.
Work on that maybe between now and when it comes back to us on council.
I would just say that we might want to just extend it to 90 days and have it stick to completion. It sounds, Mr. Vinson usually comes up with very good ideas, but a progress report is one other thing that would be, I think, difficult to obtain. And then there's another due date that we're not sure when we should place it at.
Well,
one wonders the level of trouble that we would be going to.
Well, that's a point that I also wanted to kind of bring home is I heard that there's discussion about an MOU or an agreement between the city or something like that. It's my understanding that the council runs these programs all the time, and that they occur in conjunction with teen court, but they also occur independently. They accept all comers, as I understand it. I mean, these programs are out there to assist people in the community that need these things. It's my understanding, and the way I drafted this ordinance was anticipating it's the burden of the violator to, 1, get into the program, 2, complete the program, 3, bring us evidence of that in a timely fashion before they get their violation waived. So it's my sense that the violator has every incentive in the world, whether we tell them to give us a progress report or something else, they're trying to avoid a $1,000 civil penalty. So I'm not that concerned about it. I mean, it'll be another piece of paper for someone to track, but I'm more concerned that someone starts a waiver process and has it drag out where we're wondering, hey, where are you now? And it's now 90 days, and we haven't heard from them since the very beginning. So we can work on a solution for this.
And Mr. McDermott, you have a recommendation?
Well, my recommendation would be to install something about a second offense and third offense, just to make sure it's within
in the
ordinance.
Carpinteria model?
Yeah.
Just with our level of fines, not the Carpinteria level?
Yeah.
Somebody have a motion? Mr. Francisco?
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to make one more comment regarding Mr. Vincent's mention of the tight time limit. I think that's an excellent idea. I don't really think we have to worry about something going over. I'm sure that's something that could be negotiated with the hearing officer in a informal way. I think it would add too much complexity to add these progress reports and other things to the ordinance itself. So I'm in favor of the relatively tight time limit.
Okay, so if no one's going to make a motion, the chair will. I will make a motion to recommend the social host ordinance to the city council with a graduated step up in fines with the Carpinteria model, but with a base fine of $1,000 as has been in the recommendation. And so you don't like 90? No, I'm gonna. How about 75 days of the receipt of the violation?
I'll second that. And Mr. Chair?
Yes.
While I am seconding that, I want to thank the ADAP program and the participants in ADAP who have really, and also our youth council who brought all this for me to light at their Speak Out in May a year ago. and I think that's when it was, and over at Cabrillo Arts Center, and that was just phenomenal. And I was so impressed by the quality of the presentation by the different members of the committee, of the group, and also those others who had participated and were encouraged to just speak out of their personal experiences. And one of the things that was very compelling to me was that the young people get into vulnerable positions very often when alcohol is involved. And girls very often are in very vulnerable positions after having been at a party like this, not even for their own use of alcohol, but for the fact that the associates at the party might have gotten involved and been inebriated and been out of their minds and done bad things. So I really made the connection for me, and I could see it. And also to bring forward, you had a sheriff from Ventura County, I think, come up and speak. Really added validity to the whole idea, and shared their experience. So then the other piece of it is to take that ball and follow it down the court all the way to today, and then hopefully on to council. And I just really appreciate that. I think that's bringing legislation, if you will, at the local level into existence so it can make a difference for people in the future. That's the height of civic responsibility, and I very much appreciate you all for doing that. Thank you very much for stepping up.
One of the things I thought was interesting is looking at the psychological profile of people who are drinking, and especially with young men, the largest reason of drinking is simply to do fun and silly stuff. So you have an excuse to do fun and silly stuff that then you don't necessarily need to be responsible for because you have the excuse that you were drunk. Of course, it's possible to do fun and silly stuff without having needing that excuse, and that's what I would submit, that it's in some ways a desire to be able to do certain wild and crazy things and have an excuse, and alcoholism is a terrible ramification if all it is the need to have an excuse. So I think that's something to think about with you and your peers, and with the people in this community, and any parents that are watching. And we have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye. Oh, Mr. Francisco.
Discussion.
Discussion of the motion. Do we have any, that wasn't enough discussion for you, Mr. Francisco?
No, there wasn't.
Okay.
I really don't understand why we want to change the 60 days. I really think that 60 days is more than enough time for somebody to get the ball rolling. And in those rare cases where they can't complete, we'll know, and we know there's going to be an informal method of taking care of these things. I think having a relatively tight rein, and I don't think 60 days is that tight, is a good idea. And it's certainly something that if it turns out to be a huge problem, we could deal with later.
Well, I tried to lower from the 90 to get you in on it, Mr. Francisco. I think the logic is this. No one in Carpinteria took advantage of the program. Now, maybe that's a function of the level of fine, but it also might be a function of the fact that we have no system set up in place yet for how to do that. And so I think it's, given that we do not yet have anything worked out between nonprofits and the city administrator's office as to how those would be handled, to expect someone to sign up, get scheduled for, and complete a program that we haven't worked out the details of all in 2 months is just a little bit ambitious for me. Mr. House?
That's just a suggestion here. We don't, I think the concern is a pragmatic or practical one, whether somebody can actually get signed up and take and complete within 60 days a valid program, and when it would be meaningful. I don't think we need to actually nail that down in today's meeting. I think our goal is to send this on to City Council, but between now and the time it comes to Council, I would really like our staff to work together with some of the service providers and to come up with some method. Either keep it at 60 days and then allow for that provision that you're talking about to be formalized, so that there's a way to arrange for a program that maybe is a 6-week parenting program or something that's important. Or on the other hand, if it's to realize that it's not necessary to go to that length, that 60 days is just fine. But I think we could leave that open-ended as long as the staff knows our intent is to get these things completed in as short a time as possible. in an authentic way, then maybe they can come up with language that would help us when it comes to council.
That's fine with me. I just would caution, I understand your point, Mr. Vincent, that it's not our problem, it's their problem to complete it in the 60 days. But if it's not completable in 60 days very easily,
Right.
then we lose the intent behind it, which is to get people in the education program. So I think we need to nail that down, and I'm fine for
Can we let
leaving that
staff
open.
work with some of the providers and
Sure.
come up with something that really is plausible? And then I think we all really just want it to be effective. We don't want to we're not trying to give somebody an opt-out and just stretch it out forever. That's not the idea.
So with the permission of the seconder, I'll revise the motion to be a recommendation to council to pass the social host ordinance with the Carpinteria style ramp up, but with a base of 1,000, and with the level, with the days of receipt of notice of violation to be determined by a staff, or to be advised by staff at the council presentation.
Right. And they've got the sense of our committee discussion, I think, right? Sure. Okay, good.
Great.
Yes.
Okay, there's a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
And thank you, staff, for working with everybody to make this happen. I mean, that took a lot of effort to get it here, and all of you who came today, very much appreciate it. And I thought it was great that we did have this complement of folks here to help us work this out, and it wouldn't have been as good of a conversation if we missed it, so thank you.
Mr. McDermott, a parting comment?
Well, it started with a focus group, and now it's all the way to being approved by the ordinance committee. And I would just like to thank you for the opportunity for the youth, for us to sit on this committee, because it started with us, and now it's also being continued with us and with you also. And I would just like to thank everyone here and the committee itself.
Well said. Thank you guys for participating and for bringing up the idea. And I also want to thank some of the other youth that aren't here today, because some of them had to be in some tough audience. I remember watching Gretchen present this idea to the a legislative idea group of young people, and it was shot down, among that group. So I know it's not always popular with all of your peers. So we appreciate even more so your advocacy for it. We're adjourned.